So I think we can start. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our last ASEAN-Australia Digital Trade Standards webinar of 2022. My name is Sarah, and on behalf of the Access Partnership, RMIT and DFED team, a warm welcome. Before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emergent, and extend that respect to all people. The topic of our webinar today is Women and Digital Transactions, Expanding Financial Access to Women and Women-Led MSMEs. And we have put together a panel of passionate experts and practitioners that are well placed to share their on-the-ground insights on how we can better address the issues and challenges surrounding the topic. Before we dive into the discussions, just a quick note that today's meeting will be recorded. Questions are encouraged, and you may type them into the chat box throughout the session, or you can use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion. Please also note that your microphone is automatically muted and will need to be turned on for us to hear you. So to moderate our session today, we have the esteemed Professor Annie Koh, Professor Emeritus of Finance and Senior Advisor of the Business Families Institute at Singapore Management University. Professor Koh wears many hats. She's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on New Agenda for Work, Wages and Job Creation. And she advises several private sector firms, including startups and nonprofit organizations, amongst many other engagements. More importantly, and within the context of our webinar, Professor Koh is a strong believer and advocate of empowering women and women-led MSMEs for greater financial access. We are grateful that Professor Koh has set aside time out of her busy schedule to lead this discussion. Without further ado, Professor Koh, the platform is yours, and I'll leave you to introduce our wonderful panel.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. I believe I have, attendees coming out from all time zones. And what's even more amazing is we actually have a sterling panel. I think, Sarah, I will never be able to do due credit to the introduction to each of them. But can I appeal to everyone? I think the reason why we are all gathered here is for a very simple reason. We believe strongly in financial inclusion, and we felt very strongly that having access to financing and platforms are very important for the women around the world. So what I'm going to do is I encourage every one of you to start typing in into the chat, even when each of our presenter is sharing with you something that they are very passionate about. And it's done in no particular order. I felt very strongly that in order to promote financial inclusion for women founders of micro and small medium enterprises in ASEAN, there are much we could learn from many of the solutions, platforms, partnerships across the world. So we are actually looking at 3 Ps. We are looking at what's the purpose? Why? Why do we need this? Why are we having this conversation? Why are we closing the year with such an important issue? And then the second P is policies. I think we can only do good, do better if we have clear policies put in place and translates policies into practices. And again, we have public-private people partnership in this audience. So maybe through the sharing, we can get each one of you ignited and fired up so that you could do more and it could stretch out to the organizers or to individuals who have shared with you. And the final P is no one could do this alone. So we really need to leverage on pure partnerships, platforms, and a lot more of that conviction in every one of us to build that better and broader. So what we are going to do is address the why first. Why does it matter? And I cannot think of a better person to introduce the reason why than Caroline Rubin. And none of you will realize it because she looks so good. Caroline, it's 1 a.m. in US time for her. But she's so passionate, serving as the chief of party of the 12 million ASEAN USAID Inclusive Growth in ASEAN through a program called Innovation, Trade and E-Commerce Project. And that's why the word Ignite. And she has been, this whole platform has been implemented by Nathan Associates. So we want to give credit to Nathan as well for having let us have Caroline. And currently in this role, she's actually overseeing all the technical and operational aspects of the project, managing a team of 11 staff and a 900,000 Women's Entrepreneurship Grant. I'm not going to read about the many things that she does because as she shared, it would come across. And guess what? She holds a degree in government and politics from the University of Maryland and a master in public policy degree from Georgetown University. So can we have Kevin help Caroline with the slides? And Caroline, all yours. And thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you, Professor Ko, and thanks to Access Partnership and our MIT team for the opportunity to join this panel this afternoon. As Professor Ko mentioned, my name is Caroline Rubin, and I lead the ASEAN USAID Inclusive Growth in ASEAN through Innovation Trade and E-commerce project implemented by Nathan Associates. Nathan is a global analytic and economic consulting firm delivering practical solutions and lasting results to government and commercial clients around the world for more than 75 years. And Nathan's been a proud partner of ASEAN for more than 15 years and in the region for even longer. And today I'll draw upon my experience at Nathan providing technical assistance to both ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, also known as APEC. Next slide, please. So I'll start my presentation today with a brief overview of the current state of play on women in digital transactions, focusing on women-owned and led businesses. Next slide, please. So why is the use of digital payments important for women-led MSMEs? First, digital financial services and digital transactions can facilitate women's access to finance for their business by helping them build credit. This is important for women entrepreneurs in particular, as women tend to have more limited assets, which are necessary for traditional access to finance. The use of alternative sources of data can be used to demonstrate repayment capacity and willingness to repay, which are criteria that credit bureaus typically use to assess credit history and creditworthiness. The use of alternative sources can enable entrepreneurs and MSMEs to build credit histories even without having had access to credit previously. Alternative sources of information to build creditworthiness can include data from apps, digital financial services, utility bill payment information, and transaction history for women-owned businesses. For instance, ASEAN member states such as Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia actually provide utility bill information to credit bureaus. And MasterCard and Unilever have a program outside of ASEAN where they enable shopkeepers to establish credit through digital transaction history. So in these ways, digital transactions can actually help facilitate women's access to finance. Second, use of digital payments enables women to take part and benefit from the boom in e-commerce in the region. Converting or adding an e-commerce component of a business is challenging, and setting up an in-house payment system can pose security risks. So established digital payment systems can help women business owners transition to a safe and secure online presence. And use of digital payments can also help streamline the customer experience and make a smoother purchasing process, among other benefits. Third, use of digital payments is correlated with firms that are growing. There's some recent research from Visa that showed that globally, firms whose revenue grew by 5% or more are 20% more likely to use digital payments than those whose revenue declined. So this signals that the use of digital payments isn't the future, it's the now for women-owned businesses wanting to grow. Finally, digital transactions have helped women-led businesses withstand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to all of you here today. We all know that the acceleration in digitization prompted by the pandemic has increased the use of digital payments. And according to the same research by Visa, prior to the pandemic, women were less likely than men to actually start and lead businesses. But this changed over the past 2 years when women became more likely to start firms, particularly minority women. the newer women-led firms that withstood the initial impacts of COVID-19 better than other businesses were more likely to use digital payments, which is an interesting finding. So moving on to the next slide. It's important to highlight that most women-owned businesses are micro, small, and medium-sized. According to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, there are 61.3 million women in ASEAN who own and operate businesses, and most of those are MSMEs. So because businesses women own are so concentrated in this size, the benefits of digital payments to MSMEs more broadly are worth noting today. Some of these include lower transaction costs, expanded market access and participation in cross-border trade due to faster, more secure and predictable flows of funds, no more hassle needing to physically visit the bank. And finally, while it can't formalize a business alone, digital payments and associated formal financial services can contribute to reduced informality in the long run by helping firms overcome entry costs to the formal sector. So on the next slide, I will touch on the current state of play and challenges for women-owned and led MSMEs in the region. So first, there are somewhat low rates of internet banking, and many women still have a preference for cash payments, which affect their ability to conduct e-commerce. Mobile data of women entrepreneurs and business owners is often used for household activities, and devices are shared by children. Of course, that is increasingly the case in the past couple of years. Rural women sometimes have more limited access to affordable data plans and a lower level of digital and financial literacy than their male counterparts. Many entrepreneurs and micro businesses lack formal financial accounts and have no pathway to savings, credit, or other financial products and services that might help their business to expand. And then financial inclusion policies and strategies in the region have incorporated a gender lens, and digital policies have incorporated a gender lens, but there hasn't been as much on sort of the nexus on digital transactions and payments and gender. It's largely not there yet. And finally, there's some solid globally and regionally comparable data on the use of digital payments and digital banking, but it's largely at the individual level and not specific to how women-owned businesses use it. So on the next slide, I will just touch on a few examples of relevant initiatives and opportunities to advance women and digital transactions in the ASEAN region. So thank you. So in order to create a better enabling environment for women-owned and led MSMEs, it's really critical for governments to first understand what it means to support them and then gauge the current level of support that they're providing in order to identify the gaps that need to be addressed. So a regional diagnostic tool that has commonly set definitions and targets can be implemented at the national level is one way to facilitate this. For APEC, Nathan developed the Women-Owned Businesses and Cross-Border E-Commerce Diagnostic Toolkit. It provides governments with a better understanding of the challenges to competitiveness and growth for women-owned e-commerce businesses, and it really offers a blueprint to assess their own support for these businesses. Based on the results of the diagnostic, countries can take customized approaches or measures to respond to the gaps identified and better support women-owned businesses in areas such as trade finance, digital literacy, electronic payments, online safety and security, and more. And I'll just note that it's now being piloted in Vietnam and Mexico. So on the final slide, I'll share a little bit about making the case for policies and reforms. So policymakers and stakeholders also need quantitative information and data to justify programs and policies that ensure that women have equal opportunities to start and grow their businesses, including using digital transactions. And this is nothing new, but it's so important to generate impact data for policies that may on the surface appear gender neutral, but really are not. So we developed a model to examine the potential relationship between the use of utility payments as an alternate form of credit history and GDP growth. More specifically, the model looks at whether utility companies provide information to private credit bureaus or public credit registries, and whether that influences GDP growth. To do this, we employed an ordinary least squares regression utilizing comparable data from 218 countries. And we found that 0.82% higher annual GDP growth is expected for an Asia-Pacific economy where utility information is reported. This type of information, this is the type of information that governments across the ASEAN region could use to push for reforms. Similar analysis could be conducted specific to ASEAN for data from apps or digital financial services to demonstrate the importance of these services and this transaction data, this electronic transaction data for women starting and expanding their businesses. Next slide, please. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you all, and I look forward to answering questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Actually, I was going to encourage people to start typing in the questions. So I'm going to use the prerogative of the chairperson to ask you a very quick question. So you mentioned that the access to utility bills has been shared in Brunei, and we just returned from Brunei. Has there been any project that looks at that access to the utility bill and credit rating, and how has that helped empower the women in Brunei?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Professor Ko. I'm not aware of any impact studies in Brunei specifically, but I will note that there has been a study done in the US. It showed that 8% of the utility users were able to gain a credit score after the company began sharing and reporting that payment information. So there is some data out there, but certainly it's an area for further research, particularly in the region.
Yes, so I think that will kind of incentivize us later to think about who should be collecting the data and how do we go about sharing data. Yeah, so that's a question for later. I'm going to call on Maria now in a while when Kevin's getting the slides ready. And again, I am so impressed with all the ladies on this panel. Maria Perdomo is the Regional Manager for Asia Inclusive Digital Economies under the UN Capital Development Fund. And she brings with her 15 years of experience working with public and private sector stakeholders to bring finance, I love this line, to bring finance to the most excluded in the least developed countries across the world. And in fact, her previous role as UNCDF's Youth Finance Lead, she brought access to financial services to close to 1 million youth, of which 60% are young women and girls. And she has helped unlock almost 40 million in loans from domestic sources in sub-Saharan Africa. She has a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, the School of Public and International Affairs, and a bachelor's degree from Universidad Externado de Colombia, and from Sciences Po as well, another degree. She's fluent in Spanish, English, and French, and has advanced conversational skills in Italian. I'm so glad, Maria, that we are doing this whole webinar in English. So without further ado.
Not sure. I bet I could do it better in Spanish, but so thank you so much for the invitation, Professor Ko. It is a pleasure to join the panel with such amazing women. Today I'll be talking about some of the approaches that UNCDF has applied over the years to increase access to finance for women. But for those of you who don't know what UNCDF is, let me just give you a very quick introduction. We are the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We have a capital investment mandate to invest in least developed countries, and through different approaches and deploying different financial instruments like loans, guarantees, reimbursable grants. We support government and private sector partners to speed up the pace at which private and public capital is being mobilized for SDG achievement. So, but before I talk about what the topic that brought me today to the panel, I really want to share with you something that struck me and that has me very disappointed. So next slide. And that was the recent data that was published by the fintechs, by the World Bank, which help us see what the progress or not we've done in terms of financial inclusion worldwide. And there has been some progress, in particular in the region. There's some regions, in particular South Asia, where that gender gap is going wider and wider. And I'm fairly disappointed as well to see very low percentages still of women that own a savings account, an account where they can receive a payment, where they can make a payment. So low, in particular in LDCs in ASEAN, 38% in Laos, 33% in Cambodia, 46% in Myanmar. There's still women that are just not having access to those services. And we know that one of the biggest obstacles for women to open those accounts, and in spite of the fact that, that COVID-19 accelerated the pace at which, in a way, people were opening accounts, right? And to get digital payments, either for transfers from their own governments to help them with the pandemic, or to make payments online for the goods and services that they needed. And so one of the biggest obstacles that we still see is the lack of an ID for women. And so, for example, in Myanmar, we have that 32% of the population is not registered. And there is, for example, not a digital ID. In Laos, even though there are multiple, there have been some pilots in digital ID. There's still different government agencies that issue the IDs, and that also the progress has been very slow in that. And in Cambodia, a pilot started in 2019 with the digital ID, but it has not been fully integrated. And so now let's see if people or women are actually able to overcome that very specific obstacle of really coming forward with all the know your customer requirements necessary to open an account. They still have a whole range of obstacles that they have to overcome, that range from, for example, the lack of confidence to walk into a branch of a bank, of a financial institution, or to actually finding an affordable product that actually meets their needs in a way that makes sense. So now let's go to the next slide. And I really want to make sure that we really picture ourselves. What is it for this woman in Cambodia, for example? So imagine this women entrepreneur in Cambodia working in a small enterprise in a very remote area of the country. First, she's not able to come up with the basic KYC requirements that will allow her to register her business. And so if she's not able to register her business, she's not able also to open maybe an account for her business, to build then a relationship with a financial institution that is a meaningful one. She doesn't have an asset that she can use as a collateral with the bank, and she doesn't have any kind of like a digital footprint, that allows her to establish some kind of a collateral-based credit a free or another type of collateral-based free credit history, right? So in other words, this woman is, as we would call it in financial jargon, she's just not bankable. So the question is how we can make visible these women entrepreneurs for the domestic financial institutions and to increase access to finance for them. So now let's go to the next slide. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of UNCDF's work throughout LDCs in Asia and the Pacific. And so we work, for example, with central banks to support and lift the barriers that prevent women from access financial services. I mentioned at the beginning some of those, so KYC requirements, for example, IDs, etc. We're also co-creating with financial institutions, with fintechs, with e-commerce platforms, services that really have women at the center. And that and we support it also with catalytic grants, concessional loans or guarantees to pilot and scale up those services. And last but not least, we also are working to build digital and financial capabilities of these women so that they can actually acquire the knowledge, skills, and confidence to access and use to the best of to the best of their advantage the women that our private sector partners are putting out in the market. So now let's go with a specific example. Let's move to slide number 4, please, or next slide. And so let's talk first about our work in policy. Caroline, you mentioned the lack of data, and I couldn't agree more than that. We need more data. We need sex disaggregated data to really make sure that policymakers have the right points and that they're able to produce or develop policies that actually are helping more women to get included. So, for example, in Nepal, UNCDF has worked with the Nepal Resta Bank on a RegTech solution that helped them to gather that disaggregated data. And so now we're able to see in Province 1 in Nepal what's the percentage of women that are lacking access to financial services, for example. But we also support governments, and this is something that has been conducted in 28 plus LDCs around the world. We also support them to follow the evolution of the inclusiveness of the digital economy. And so we do that through the implementation of the Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard, or IDES. IDES, it's a very interesting tool because it helps us to, it's conducted on an annual basis. So you don't really have to wait for 4 years to get all the data. It's an engagement tool that allows us to have a conversation with the government, with the private sector, and all the stakeholders involved. And that together we're able to identify what are those market constraints that are really preventing women and other most left behind groups to access financial services and digital innovations and participating in a meaningful way from the digital economy. And last but not least, we have done also a lot of work. Currently, we support the ASEAN Working Group on Financial Inclusion to measure that evolution of the financial inclusion market in their countries. So now let's go to the second slide, to the next slide, and let's talk about different also ways that UNCDF is promoting, for example, a more like infrastructure for women and that works for women. So, and this is something that is very important because, yes, we talk about the need for women maybe to access e-commerce platforms or to make digital payments, and we know the value of that. But if they're not interoperable payment systems, for example, that allow them to do it in a seamless manner, then we're going to back to square one. Or if those interoperable payment systems are just not inclusive of the institutions that serve women, then again, we're going back to square one. So here in Myanmar, we are supporting the development of an industry-owned interoperable payment system platform that is inclusive of microfinance institutions and that has the promise to include 2 million women in Myanmar into the digital economy. That's one of the things that we're doing at this point in that level of the market. Let's go to the next slide. Where we are working with different private sector partners to really, as I was telling you at the beginning, to co-create, if you want, different products and services that really help them to address these constraints that women face. So, for example, in Cambodia, we work with Boost Capital, which is an SME that employs 50% of their employees are women and 70% of their employees are young people. And so what they do is they work with MFIs to digitize the entire process, the entire credit process for women. which in practical terms, what does it mean? This means that, for example, a woman in Cambodia, thanks to this process, doesn't longer have to go physically to the branch of a microfinance institution to get out a loan. And this is important because we managed to digitize the entire process, and she's able to, she doesn't need to go to go to that branch, and therefore we're also taking into account the fact that she has less mobility than men to access financial services. Not to mention that we're also increasing the privacy for that women to get a loan from that financial institution, which we know it's also a big barrier, a big barrier in terms of social norms that prevent women from accessing financial services. Another example is a partnership with She Investments in Cambodia, which is also an SME that has created a bookkeeping platform that supports women-owned MSMEs to keep track of their business transactions and provide financial training for women. So Karen was mentioning, for example, the importance of getting this transactional data and to use it as an alternative source for MFIs and other financial institutions, another alternative form of collateral for women. And so that they can use to back up their loan. Data is also, this transactional data is also complemented by data that helps us not only to gather the capacity to pay, which is the data that you gather from these transactions, but also the intent to pay from these women. We're able to see, okay, how many trainings this women MSME owner attended and with what frequency. That shows her discipline, that shows the intent to pay, maybe those, or that shows something very specific to her personality that transaction, just financial transaction cannot show. And so this is important to highlight, because also we're talking about this move of paradigm to create more alternative sources of credit or different sources of collateral for women. And so, although here I would say that technology does represent an opportunity to build, to help financial institutions to build these new type of credit scoring systems, what we've seen also at UNCDF is that the pandemic has hit very hard the businesses of these women for different reasons that we know. And that there's still some need from financial service providers, even though e-commerce platforms and others are building very meaningful partnerships with financial service providers, building this data, etc. We still need, in particular in LDCs, we see the need of using other types of financial instruments that allows them to de-risk these loans, like guarantees, for example, and others. Let's go to the next slide, which is almost my last one. I promise to go very quickly. It's the one related to digital and financial capabilities. We know that the baseline for women is, in terms of literacy in general, numeracy is lower than the one for men. And so so we really need to put emphasis on building these skills when we're working with women. And we know that there's a potential, for example, use alternative data points produced by e-commerce platforms to increase access to finance for women. The problem is that e-commerce platforms are dominated by male MSME owners. And so we need to find a way to really bring women and use these e-commerce platforms. So a lot of the work that we've been doing with e-commerce platforms, for example, in Bangladesh with Tulo, that's in Nepal with Tulo and Sastadil in Nepal, or eShop and ShopUp in Bangladesh, is to really help them to identify first ways to support women to register to build their skills to register into these e-commerce platforms, then use these e-commerce platforms, and then develop different trainings that help them to ease the access to these opportunities in terms of building their capabilities. So, for example, a lot of the trainings that have been developed by Tulo and eShop and ShopUp, in Bangladesh, are digitally based and provide some kind of flexibility to women to select different modules so that they are the ones who identify what are the gaps in skills and knowledge that they need to build to better access these e-commerce platforms. And that's important because we know that they need that flexibility so that they're able to spend maybe more time in their businesses or even more time with their families. And so in Bangladesh, for example, and just to close, we've seen that only by adding that digital and that flexibility, that digital feature and that flexibility to the training, we saw an increase of 25% in terms of participation among women-owned MSME owners. So just to conclude, 4 different pillars: policy, digital open payments ecosystems, innovation, and then skills. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Actually, the 4 pillars are also discussed in the chat group. All right, and I saw Sushila's question, and Carolina has, taken it, and she did agree with Sushila. Thanks for the question. Access to finance is one of the many pillars. Yes, and I know that when Maria came on, she was not happy with the data because it was the formal recourse, but there are a lot of informal access. So in case people think that Maria only looks at less developed countries, I'm going to let you know that November 11, 2022, the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the United Nations CDF have signed an MOU to jointly develop an integrated and digital financial ecosystem for MSMEs from LDCs, but operated in partnership with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Yes, and tapping on all our fintech companies, they've all set up here because I think we cannot do better if we don't include everyone. So Maria, you're going to talk to us a little bit about that later at the Q&A. Okay, good. So, you could tell so many excited women. I dare not even ring the bell and say, time exceeded. No stress, ladies. I'm going to bring on board now Christina Mayers, and Maria is based in Bangkok. So in Asian time zone, Christina is based in Singapore. And again, over 20 years of experience in Asian financial markets, in project finance, strategic corporate projects, and in credit risk. And in fact, she's regional director and the head of Southeast Asia. She leads the Women's World Banking Southeast Asia business in 3 main markets: Indonesia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the Southeast Asia team works very closely with FIs, or the financial service institutions, with ministries, with regulators, key stakeholders with its advisory solutions, policy advocacy, and research work. I really like the angle that all ladies up till now have presented, that there's evidence. And I know that a lot of you in the audience are also strong advocates. Without the evidence, how do we convince the regulators? So Christina graduated from Cornell University and the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And that's where I taught for a year before I came back to serve my bond at NUS. So she's based in Singapore. She has previously worked and lived in Jakarta. All yours, Christina.
Thank you so much, Professor Koh, and it's really an amazing pleasure to be on a panel of all women, actually. It's not often that happens. I was looking at this wonderful picture last night and wondering, how I got across the severity or the importance of the project of empowerment of women through financial inclusion. I took this picture about 3 years ago in Jakarta, the week before the COVID lockdown started. I love the expression of the older woman here. And I thought to myself, let us all stop for a moment, and I'll give you some numbers on this, but what is the likelihood that you think that between these 2 women, that they would not have access or would not use formal financial services? I mean, an informal moneylender is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, do they have a bank account? So let's just say in Indonesia right now, there are 276 million Indonesians. 118 million women in Indonesia. So if you jot on a piece of paper or on your digital notepad, I want to ask you, what do you think is the likelihood that a woman walking down the street in Jakarta or elsewhere in Java or I don't know, Kinabalu, has a bank account? And I think, I'm just kind of wondering, you could put it in the chat if you'd like. The shocking number is that even if you include for a bit of improvement with COVID, 50% of all Indonesian women are either unbanked, meaning they don't have a bank account, or they're underbanked. So that means they probably only know that they can withdraw money from their bank account, but they don't know how to send money home to the provinces. They may not know how to pay that utility bill. They may not know how to use a digital app. So I think, framing this, it's a really big issue all across Asia. I can't agree more with Caroline and with Maria. And sure, Debbie and I will be on the same wavelength. So next slide, please. And bringing this, more broadly in terms of the globe, from the local Findex survey, which is part of the World Bank, of 1 billion women totally around the world are underbanked or unserved. And there are also another 1.75 billion that have bank accounts, but they just never use them. And so maybe that's a dormant digital account that when they worked in a factory, they have an account and they don't use it, or maybe they just don't know what to do with their bank account. Next slide. And then just briefly touching on, I think Caroline and Maria have touched on a couple. I want to talk about things that they haven't talked about. Restrictive social and cultural norms. This is really important in Indonesia, elsewhere in Asia. Women may not feel comfortable going into a bank branch or working with an agent that's not a woman, or that women are more patient in terms of understanding things. Another thing is, in terms of the limited understanding of customer needs. I always find it interesting as an ex-banker that at a private banking level, people have no problem understanding and connecting with women. But as you go downscaling in retail banking, there's a lack of interest by financial institutions to try and distinguish between men and women and their needs. And then finally, poor connectivity. That's a huge issue across Southeast Asia. I mean, even for my team, we have constant problems with connectivity. So these are a couple of barriers that we're trying to face. Next slide. So Women's World Banking, that's me. I represent a team of 9 in Asia. We're a nonprofit. We work on growing financial inclusion so that women become empowered over time. We've been around for 40 years, which is a long time in the nonprofit world. In Asia, our major funders, in case you wanted to know, are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Australian government, and also the Credit Suisse APAC Foundation. And so if anybody for Credit Suisse is on the line, thank you so much. Next slide. And I'm not going to talk about this slide, much as Maria and Caroline have talked. It really is a mixture of doing solutions or advisory work, plus building the evidence base. We've just done a report on Sharia finance and a pathway to women's empowerment. And also we've done work on research on ultra micro entrepreneurs in Asia. And then we use that to talk to policymakers. Next slide. And then finally, just a bit of background in terms of, our major clients are BRI, BNI, Dana, and Indonesia. So very large financial institutions. In Cambodia, we work with the #1 wallet, Wing, and we also are working on research and policy work with the Cambodian Credit Bureau. So that's the only credit bureau in Cambodia. Next slide. So just, at a request, thought we would do a quick case study and explain what we mean by approaching through a gender lens, how we approach, women as a market. So quick turn to Wing Bank in Cambodia. So in Cambodia, 80 to 90% of factory workers are women. And Wing currently has over 200,000 digital banking accounts. And so, this is what we did with them to increase the usage of Wing services. Next. So when we first started talking to Wing, and if you could next again, sorry, is that when we started talking to Wing, one of their frustrations was that they had all of these payroll accounts, but essentially what women did was they would stand in line outside of the factory gates. And indeed, I saw that in August. There was a line of 60 women, no joke. It was going to take 2 hours to get to the front of the line. And all they were doing was cash out so they could go to the agent and then send money home. That was the primary use. So Wing came to us and said, by regulation, it's paydays twice a month. These women are losing time and they're not using our services. So what can we do? So next slide. So what we said to them is we did some institutional on-the-ground research with women. And what came back from that on-the-ground research through local research firms is, she knows how to get to the wing agent. It's very convenient. She doesn't know what banking services are. She's not familiar with a savings account. She doesn't know that she can send money home through the bank. And then more fundamentally, she doesn't even know that she can do this all on her phone. And most of the factory workers do indeed have phones. They use it all the time for Facebook, Telegram, whatever. And so that's what we set out to do. Next. So just a couple of things about the barriers that we face. First of all, you can see here that over 50% of the people, the women that we surveyed, they just didn't understand how to use the app. Also, I point out the second one is 46% were afraid of making mistakes. And so, as Caroline and Maria said, it's about digital financial capability and the lack of confidence in knowing what to do. Next slide. The other challenge that we had, next slide. The other challenge that we had to face was that they were so used to agents, and so it was too easy to use an agent. So how do you transfer these women to using a mobile app? So that was a big thing we had to work on. Next. So here's the ultimate question, what were we going to do to make sure that they used the app and that they learned how to do different things with their bank accounts? Next. And so there were really two principles. I think Maria talked a bit about it. So one was activation. So we were working to build awareness of all the things. We asked women, what do you really want to do with money? What is it that you do? What is in your daily transactions? And so the number one thing for a factory worker is remittances. Number two is utilities and paying rent. Number three, perhaps, is buying things and getting a loan. So we've really focused down on the remittance value as being ease as a use case. And then the second thing was engagement. And again, this is about digital financial capability, making women comfortable with the app, giving them tutorials and working on it, providing them with greater confidence in using formal financial services. Next. And so here are a couple of examples. We used the firm of trusted advisors. What we did was we had the team leaders. They would do one, see one, in a sense, that the team leader would show them how to do a transaction, and then the woman would get a free transaction and she would do it. We had tutorials either on posters in the factories, or we would do it on videos on Facebook. And then finally, making sure that we message them at the right time of the month. So the day before payday, are you sending money home? Why don't you try using the Wing app? So sort of imprinting that in the way that they approach financial services. Next. And finally, I'm not going to go through this, we don't have time, but just this is a full design of the customer journey. So all the way through, very thorough, really changed the way that women thought of Wing as a bank and how they interacted with the mobile app and gave them confidence. Next. And so for anybody who's interested in the commercial side of it, really important, in the pilot that we did, the outcome was that we increased the customer lifetime value 8 times over 3 years. As of today, the solution has reached over 50,000 women, and by the end of the month, it will be up to 90,000 women digital payroll customers of Wing. And they're incrementally rolling it out across their network. So finally, next, I just wanted to include this snapshot, obviously a long time ago with me and my brother, but I think it really has some key points as a snapshot to visualize what's going on here. It is a journey for women. Sometimes we need a little bit of help in growing that confidence and that capability, but we want to do it alone. We're very capable, and we will find a way. Just help us on the journey. So thank you all, and look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Christina. I really like it that you shared a case study. And, it's remiss of me to not mention that actually, the Women's World Banking has a global reach of 62 partners in 35 countries, serving more than 169 million women clients. So congratulations for being a 45-year-old US nonprofit organization. And I guess you are working directly with many of the financial institutions and the ecosystem of solution players, right? Yes. And
policymakers. I'll be killed by my colleagues if I don't say that.
Yes, yes, and the policymakers. So again, it's a public-private people partnership, and we couldn't go anywhere without that 3 Ps. I'm going to go to our last speaker, Debbie, and I think throughout both all the 3 ladies, Caroline, Maria, and Christina's presentations, there's a strong emphasis on financial literacy and skills. So I cannot think of a better person to, wrap this up, and that's Debbie. And Debbie's the CEO of Lucy, and I met Debbie recently at the Singapore FinTech Festival. We were sitting at the same lunch table, and I could relate with the word Lucy because we all watched the sitcom I Love Lucy. And I did ask her, why Lucy? And she said, see, I didn't even have to say anything, and you know that it's a platform for women. So Debbie has 20+ years of experience in technology for finance, mobile-enabled products and services, and business and strategy consulting. And she has worked in over 35 countries as well. Very much focused on customer-centric market research, product development, engagement. But she says, let it not be known that Lucy is just a platform. It's a neobank. It is built to help women who are overlooked, underestimated, underbanked, and to help them become unstoppable by leveling the financial playing field. So Lucy aims to empower women from all walks of life by equipping them with financial services, growth tools, and peer support so that they can grow and thrive. Debbie, all yours.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen.
Yes. Oh, I had people asking, could they have access to the slides? Ladies, maybe you let the organizers know, or you have a more, clean up version that you could share. Then maybe, yeah, for people who have signed up, I think they deserve the slides. Yeah, but who am I to say? I'm only the moderator. Okay, Debbie, all yours.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much indeed. And I think part of what I'm just going to really talk about echoes what everybody has been saying, but we are a practitioner, we're a company who have actually decided to do something about this. And what I want to just touch on to start off with is kind of the main reason that we're doing what we're doing, which a lot of it is echoing what the other panelists have been talking about, but also recognizing the huge opportunity here. We know that there are many sort of roadblocks and that the many banks don't really recognize the needs of women, but also there are huge opportunities as well. And I kind of like to describe it in terms of this piece of algebra, if anyone remembers this from school, which is really XX equals 2x. And why is that important? Well, the first statistic here is that for every dollar of funding, startups that are generated by women actually tend to be twice as profitable as the average. This is a statistic that's been backed up by many organizations. Boston Consulting Group in particular has done some research which shows this, that women-owned businesses actually tend to be more successful than their male-owned counterparts, given the same opportunities. And in addition to that, that women spend more than twice of their income on their family's education and healthcare. So up to 90%. So if we kind of think about that, that's sort of the impact here of women-owned businesses is as far as the benefits to society and the socio benefits to family, say education and healthcare, actually are probably more like 4 times as much, because it's twice as profitable and twice as much of the profits that are actually going into helping people in their community and for long-term growth. And one of the quotes that we always like to repeat is that from Melinda Gates, which is really saying that when money flows into the hands of women, actually everything changes. And the key point here as well is that empowering and enabling women to start and grow their own businesses actually therefore makes sense for everyone, for women and men. And this is really the thesis for what Lucy is doing, and why we actually set up the company in the first place, is that we recognised that if we actually want to empower economic growth, the single most effective thing that we can actually do is empower women entrepreneurs to be successful, for just this reason. And so this is the most important part of what I wanted to talk about, is to say that, you know, if we think about empowering and enabling women to start and grow their own businesses being such a powerful thing that we can do, you'd kind of think that banks really would focus on female entrepreneurs, right? But unfortunately, the reality is that they don't. And here are a few statistics. I think some people have already quoted some of these, but 70% of women entrepreneurs are financially excluded. In addition to that, 84% of business bank loans go to male-owned businesses. And on top of that, even when women do get loans, they tend to actually have more conditions attached to them, or they tend to be for a smaller amount than male-owned businesses who have got comparable revenue and turnover streams. And in addition to that, I think this is quite a well-known fact as well, that 97% of venture capital goes to male entrepreneurs. There was a great statistic that was quoted a while ago that said, I think it was in about 2019, that the total amount of investment in women-owned businesses globally altogether was $1.5 billion less than SoftBank invested in WeWork. I think it's kind of, we just have to sort of pause and think about these kind of things. If we look at all the information that's coming out here about how successful women can be and what positive impacts they can have on their own society, and yet, and this is the and yet. And as you mentioned as well, I've worked in 37 countries around the world over the past 22 years, focused on financial inclusion. I've worked literally everywhere from DR Congo to Pakistan to Papua New Guinea. And I'd really seen pretty much the same thing, was that mainstream financial institutions, by and large, are not interested in understanding needs of or serving women entrepreneurs. And I can only really describe this as complacency, because it's kind of so much easier to just carry on with the status quo of offering products that don't really completely serve anybody's needs. And so let's just give another loan, and as long as someone repays it, we'll just give them another loan. And I've seen this in so many places. My two co-founders, who are obviously here, you can see from the picture, of both male, have really seen exactly the same thing. They came from different backgrounds. Hal is ex-bank CEO from Yoma Bank in Myanmar. He was also the founder and chairman of the board for Wave Money in Myanmar. And Luke Jansen, who founded and built an app development company to up to 8 countries, 300 people, and then sold it in 2017. But they'd both seen the same thing, which was that by and large, banks weren't really interested in understanding about the needs of women. And as a result of this, most women were excluded from the formal financial system. And so we, between us, really decided to do something about this. And what we did was we looked at the needs here of female entrepreneurs and recognised that the needs were firstly tailored financial services that actually reflected their cash flows and the different types of cash management situation that they were encountering, but also more practical and holistic services. So things like entrepreneurship skill training, as well as access to a supportive peer and mentoring community. Because one of the things that we have seen as well is that female micro entrepreneurs also very much need community support. And in order to make this accessible and cost effective, to actually deliver all of this through a mobile phone. Now, obviously, this is quite a broad spectrum of services. And the key thing for us as well has been really making sure that it really is intuitive and delightful to use. And so we've spent a lot of time on our app design and our user interface. We wanted it to feel very personal. We wanted it to feel very welcoming. We've had a number of people say to us that they actually felt that Lucy was a little bit like their big sister, which is really exactly how we wanted it to feel. And so everything that we've done from the name onwards has really been about making this feel somewhere that a female entrepreneur and women in general feel welcome. And on top of that, I think we launched in Singapore last year. I think we probably got Singapore's best looking debit cards. And we've had quite significant growth over the past year in Singapore, which, as I'm sure many people know, is quite saturated when it comes to banking. But nonetheless, we've seen really great uptake and, more importantly, really great usage. People are actually using their Lucy accounts more and more. The statistics that we're getting in now for number of transactions per customer per month are more than a lot of the more established banks already. The next step for us really is to move to other countries. We're engaging with lots of different banking partners in a range of different countries, both in Southeast Asia, but also South America and East Africa as well. Our model is to partner with banks rather than to compete with them. And in order to do this, the approach that we take is that we actually build Lucy on top of their existing banking platform and deliver tailored products and services that are relevant and useful for female micro entrepreneurs under the Lucy brand, but with the sort of subtext of powered by XYZ Bank. And what this enables us to do is to actually provide the tailored products and services with the warm and welcoming UI and a differentiated brand that doesn't dilute the existing brand of the bank and yet is bringing them the benefits of a consolidated balance sheet. This is our approach going forwards. We're starting, as I say, we're already talking to a number of banks in different countries, and we'll be expecting to launch Lucy in a range of different countries starting early next year. So that's just really kind of a wrap up on what we're doing. As I say, we have really seen that we can achieve two things at the same time, one of which is that we can have a really good, solid, profitable business. And in doing so, we can drive significant financial inclusion and also economic empowerment and building economies in a range of different countries all at the same time.
Great, thank you very much. I hear an echo. So, okay, I'm going to get all the ladies on screen, and now we have only about 25 minutes before they close the session at around 3:30. So I'm going to take one or two of the questions that's on the chat because they are very much related to where we want to go. So I love, the questions about evidence and policy, and, how do we share the evidence so that we could know we are not reinventing the wheel. I think, let's see. Christina, you did mention that, many of the countries trying to change from within, cultural challenges. How do we really share evidence-based policies in order to shift women's economic empowerment throughout the world? You answered a question that Albert was posing. So maybe you could start. Christina?
Sorry. Okay. I think, I would just sort of say that fundamentally it's, one of the things that we often do with other policymakers in countries is start by establishing workshops and ideation sessions to find out what are the issues that they're looking at, what are the barriers they're facing. And so it's got to be, a collaborative environment in terms of what we're doing. So I would say that's the fundamental thing, and we've been doing that. I'll give an example. In Indonesia, we did some research about a year and a half ago as I mentioned, on women ultra micro entrepreneurs, and sort of we helped establish personas of a typical micro entrepreneur. And then from that, what was interesting was that part of the Ministry of Finance, they have special loan programs. And so that they could tell from the research what it was that women needed. And I think in the chat and what Debbie was talking about is many women just don't have access to loans. And so what they made sure was that their policy directives insisted that in terms of if you wanted that government loan and you're one of the financial service providers that is giving the government loan, that you have to do it outside of Java. So that's an example of, we started with ideation and what's bothering you, then worked together with the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Social Affairs and said, this is a problem that the loans stay in Java and they don't go overseas. And so we've seen an actual policy action taken. So I think that's a great example, but you can't come pounding on people's doors and telling them they're doing something wrong or they need to change. I think it's about working together to figure out what the issues are and what evidence is needed to make change.
Okay, great. What about you, Caroline? Because you do a lot of work and you mentioned, policy is a very critical piece for that women empowerment. Where do you come in on, how do we move the needle? How do we rethink the policy making process in order to make inclusion work?
Sure. Well, thanks for the great question. I think, a lot of my work has focused in regional organizations like ASEAN and APAC. So I think, thinking about those as unique forums and venues to kind of leverage the regional lens. So bringing together policymakers from across the region. There's a lot of diversity in both ASEAN and APAC, particularly in APAC, and a lot to be learned from each other. So I think, at the risk of sounding traditional, policy convenings, I think are still quite important. But I also think the in-depth research, pulling together those best practices, the work on that needs to be done sort of before people come together in the room. So,
very good. But Maria, you worked with diverse continents. And, having worked with Sub-Saharan Africa and engaged policymakers there, and then now sitting in Bangkok, working with the China Valley countries. How do you engage Asian policymakers from African policymakers? Is there a cultural difference?
There are many, yes, in fact. But I think there's a lot of opportunities also for learning and cross-lateral learning. In fact, at the beginning of at the end of my presentation, you asked me about the partnership with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And yes. This whole thing started also as a way, that MAS has a very successful program in supporting Ghana. Right. And so now bringing some of these innovations from Singapore to Ghana, it was wonderful to see. I was in the Singapore FinTech Festival 2-3 weeks ago. It was wonderful to see all the central bankers from Ghana also in the Singapore Central Festival. So I think there's a lot of ways of opportunities and lateral learning from the two regions. South-South cooperation should be at the very center. One of the things that I see that is similar in both regions as we speak is that more and more, because of the digitalization of finance, right? We do need to, historically, our main counterpart of UNCDF when it came to financial inclusion was the central bank, right? Mm-hmm. But more and more, it touches so many other stakeholders in the government that we can, we need a lot of coordination role in the countries where we work, with Ministry of ICT, with Ministry of Agriculture, with Ministry of Women's Affairs. And so that's one part. Another thing that I see, it's data-driven, and Christina already mentioned some of the things that they do in terms of building different use case from private sector partners to help regulators and government representatives into this policy development process. But I think it's also important to have it at government level. I mentioned some of the during my presentation, some of the initiatives of UNCDF, in terms of IDES, for example. But I also wanted to maybe recently we did a very small analysis and quick and dirty analysis of transactions of the Nepal National Clearing House, where we found, for example, that like a very, very small percentage of transactions have been done by women. And so that's an opportunity. So how can we use this data actually to increase the usage and the inclusion of women? And I think that all the stakeholders need to be participating in the process, not only across government agencies, but also private sector. Private sector needs to be on the table. I remember once when I was working in Gambia, it was probably the first time that the financial institutions were sitting on the same table for different reasons, because of history, for different reasons with the central bank. And so those conversations need to happen there. And then last but not least, more South-South cooperation across central bankers. I mean, Caroline, you did a very good point out the importance of regional cooperation. I think those forums for central bankers across. 2 weeks ago, I was on a very nice forum organized by Amazon Web Services, who brought all these central bankers from different countries in the region here to Bangkok. ESCAP, our colleagues from UNESCAP, they do also a lot. And it's all about partnerships, I think. Very important data-driven policies, partnerships, and everyone on the table.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to you, Debbie, because Jack actually says, how did you wake up the financial sector on their sluggish support to the women in business? Because you were quoting an example towards the end where you were actually white labeling behind one of the financial institutions, to use the Lucy app, right?
Yes, well, actually, yeah, our approach is that we don't wait for them to wake up. Is that we just say we do it. Because I think that's the only thing, right? I mean, if they were going to do something, they would have done it by now. And I think that's really our approach, is saying that we do this. So it's actually kind of not, it's the opposite of white labeling from our side of things. We're doing this, we're delivering this in a particular country under the Lucy brand with the Lucy look and feel. And we're actually combining this. So it's not just a tech solution. What we're doing as well is combining this with our own experience in customer-centric product design. To actually, I've done lots and lots of work on this over the years in more places than I could care to mention as well. But actually ensuring that the products and services that are delivered through Lucy are accessible, relevant and valuable to the particular different demographics in that particular country. Because of course, what Singapore needs has been very much tailored towards what Singapore needs, but what somebody else somewhere else needs, what Cambodia needs, for example, is going to be a bit different, right? Actually, there are some similarities, so it's more tweaking than like completely redesigning. But this is basically our approach, is saying that we will tailor and deliver the products and services that are needed by women entrepreneurs in particular through the Lucy app, so that it's combining a place where they feel welcome with an intuitive and welcoming user interface with products and services that are actually relevant and valuable. And what we do then is to say to the bank, do what you do best, which is not very much, and we'll bring you this consolidated balance sheet. And that's kind of actually it's being shown to be kind of really appealing to a lot of banks, because I think a lot of them are recognizing, yeah, there's this group that they don't really know anything about, but they don't have the faintest idea how to get started. And I had this before. I lived in Indonesia and a bunch of other countries as well, where they're kind of saying, well, how do we serve a new segment because we don't understand this group? Well, you need a new group of people that do understand the segment, right? And that's really what we're bringing as well, is to say, look, we'll do this for you, and in effect bring you that consolidated balance sheet at the end. And this is really appealing to banks, because what we're also doing is not diluting their brand. And so our approach has basically been like, we're not waiting for policy or anything. We're just kind of getting on and doing it.
Yes, very good. So I'm going to do something which have never been done before. There's 4 of you on this panel. I'm going to go and ask each of you, what's the biggest gap where you sit right now in empowering women? All right. And then you turn to someone on this panel and say, I think we could work together. Anyone can start. All right. So where you sit right now, where do you see the biggest gap in relation to what we have just been discussing, expanding financial access to women and WSMEs? So how do we do better? Why don't we start with our panel of speakers? Are there ways in which you could see collaborative opportunities? Because we want to end on a high note. So where can you find the best opportunities? Then 4 wonderful women who have given their time in the last 1.5 hours to share your passion. What's keeping you awake right now? What's one exciting project that you're working on? And you think that the women on this panel and the women and men in the audience might get excited about and would like to reach out to you. Okay, Debbie, you go first. And you don't do a pitch. Don't do a pitch. Yeah, do something.
No. If I can start, I mean, you know, we're a startup, so you know, we don't have a broad reach right now. I think one of the single biggest things that needs to really happen is for banks to know about what we're doing, and that and to let them know that we're looking for partnerships that can actually benefit them as well as us.
So legitimate financial institutions or even any other new bank partner, right?
No, what we're looking for is regulated financial institutions, so banks in countries that don't serve this segment and are kind of hypothetically interested in serving it. And so there are lots of concerns that they often have, which is, oh, it's going to be expensive. The cost of serving each customer is quite expensive, and what is actually needed. We're really very much looking to partner with banks in all countries, really, who are looking to get these kind of benefits. So I think from this group here, certainly if there are banks that you know of it would be good for us to talk to, I'd love to talk to them.
So I'm going to run to Christina. Christina, is there an opportunity in what you're doing right now that can lead to Debbie reaching out to you, or is there something else that you're also building and you'd like to get Debbie or Caroline or Maria involved?
I was going to say, I smiled when Maria's presentation talked about Boost Capital, because they're already part of our network. And we're working with them, and it's interesting how the world weaves or whatever. You know, I think just to answer your question, the number one keeping us up at night at Women's World Banking unfortunately, it has to be digital financial capability. And I hate to put the burden on the women's side, but that's you know, certainly something that keeps us up at night. But in terms of our business in the region and perhaps the audience out there, one of the things that happened recently was we had a corporate volunteer from Credit Suisse, from Europe of all places. And you know, when we work with a partner, we do an ideation workshop to understand the women's uses and look at the customer journey. So my call out to the audience at large is, if you have a corporate volunteer program and you have experience in retail or micro retail product design, it was really very interesting to have somebody externally come and join the ideation process, in this case with BNI, Bank Nasional in Indonesia. So I'd be interested. I'm on LinkedIn. Ping me. Indonesia or Cambodia is where you would go. Thank you.
See, Debbie, you can ping Christina as well. Then she's looking for corporate sponsors and volunteers so that can do the ideation process together with her. Perfect. See, that's why you take part in panels for. Caroline, I know you're all the way in Washington, but ASEAN is so close to you. What's something that you love to have the collaboration of our ASEAN audience working on a project with you?
Yeah, so I think it was Maria who mentioned about the norms piece of this, and I think maybe I would like even expand on that to the discrimination piece, which I think was also mentioned later in the panel. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how to work with ASEAN and the ASEAN Economic Community on those issues. I think when we talk about traditional access to finance, those are salient and those are discussed. But I think the challenges are really what I think Maria was highlighting around the norms and kind of the behavioral aspects, stereotyping, etc. There's a lot more there, I think, to unpack. But I think the challenge of communicating that to policymakers who are more on the economic side, or some of the more traditional agencies is the challenge for those of us working directly with ASEAN and its sectoral bodies. So definitely, keen to hear more about Maria's work and where some overlap or rather complementarity might be.
Very nice. I actually love the angle because it's not just about finance, it's also about behavioral changes and behavioral norms. And in fact, Albert, I must give him credit, he says opening of bank account is one thing, usage of it is another. I think he's trying to say, let's encourage financial literacy training where all members of a family can attend, and not just the mother, but the father, the mother, and maybe an adult sibling. So in that way, shared decisions are made when it comes to financial decisions. And then the women can also be empowered because the men and the rest of the families recognize her as an important member of the family. And I think he's sharing this from an experience in Papua New Guinea. Yeah, so I think women are also very inclusive. Beyond just learning for ourselves, we also want members of the family to learn. Final word from you, Maria. What's keeping you awake, sitting where you are in Bangkok with the countries?
You know exactly. You know exactly because you tell it at the introduction. Least developed countries. That's what keeps me awake. And so I want to see more partnerships. I want to see joining forces with USAID and bringing more regional forces to really help or support LDCs and bringing these innovations and supporting policymakers to the LDCs. But I also want to build partnerships with the private sector partners like Lucy, for example. I want to bring those innovators to least developed countries. And I think that speaks a lot about of UNCDF work to really fostering these lateral learning opportunities across the region. And honestly, I am one of the biggest fans of the world, of the work of Women's World Banking. Every time that I've collaborated with Women's World Banking in the past, it has been a learning journey. I've done it in Africa in the past, and I look forward to expand that opportunity here in Asia, and in particular for least developed countries. So I'm very excited, and I think the sky is the limit.
Thank you very much. You guys have actually done my last round. That was my last round where I was trying to tell everyone, both the audience as well as the panelists, that this is only the beginning and there's so much more to do. And actually, I was looking at the announcement from the Monetary Authority partnering with UNCDF is to build integrated financial ecosystem for least developed countries. So it's actually all of us in this room. And, we can only do this if we all come together. So I'm going to ask the organizers maybe to make available either the LinkedIn, of our panelists. And of course, ladies, it would be great if you could share your slides with our audience. And on that note, I'm going to let all of you sign off because there's a heavy rain outside in Singapore. I don't know if anybody needs to travel home. Yeah. But meanwhile, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, a wonderful panel, and happy holidays ahead to everyone. Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks.